actually not only in the country like Nepal, this experiences, this kind of experiences, we are scholars here and many constitutional practitioners have really seen and observed and really contributed to make Constitution applicable, implementable, realizable, those rights, during this period of transition. We have today actually three, from all the sessions, that we have seen that actually the commentators are more than commentators alone. They have been presenting their independent views, additional views in addition to making comments. So we have three scholars and practitioners who have had experiences of really was watching closely and also being part of the constitution building process around the world. We have today the Dr. John Pache from Australia. He has had experience of teaching at the University of New South Wales and has, he has experienced in many countries in transition like Iraq, Afghanistan, and there are many more. He would explain. He will be presenting managing transition, from human rights perspective. Then we have Dr. Larry Taman. Easy for us to remember, Tamang. So many people, they get confused, So Larry prefers to be called Tamang. I have heard from his mouth many times. And he is the international, actually, manager of the big participatory constitution building program. They actually, it's a very concerted effort from the donors through UNDP. So CCD, Center for Constitutional Dialogue is being run, and he is the supervisor, overall supervisor of that program, which was actually the brainchild of that whole program was Professor Yaspal Ghai. He's here, and he has been actually, he's not new to Nepal, and he was a chairman of the Constituent Assembly and Commission in Kenya, and he's still now, trying to contribute there, but in addition, he has had a lot of experience around the world. He must have, we know him well. Many of our friends know him well. So we three panelists, and we had actually some couple of more from Nepal if they arrive, because we have been receiving information that the discussion at the Constituent Assembly on the restructuring of the program, that the committee level is going on. Probably there, so. They might turn up. If they do, it will be good. If they don't, Speaker of the House, first Parliament of Nepal in 1990, actually 89. And so he has been actually also part of the peace-building process in Nepal, and behind the scene, he had helped quite a lot to negotiate the process. So Mr. Dungana is a right person to chair and moderate the discussion today. And actually, after the presentation and comments, the floor there will be opportunity for the floor to provide your comments. But one thing we have to, I must request Mr. Dungana that the discussion we must wrap up 10 minutes before 4, because Prime Minister has given us time at sharp at 4. He will kind of book, or that could be torn, or burned, by anyone. So, but to make it realizable is very, very more important for us and for the Nepalese people to ensure that our peace process takes to a logical conclusion and realizable. Rights.
And other presenters, if you want some more time. With these remarks about the nature of transition or the characteristics of transition, if time allows, I would like to make some comment during the concluding part of this session. Because in my knowledge, every transition, like every conflict, has its own characteristics. So we have to identify the characteristic, the real characteristic of our transition this time, and also see what are the challenges not only on implementation, on the nature. And that really gave me food for thought. What Dr. Ghai said this morning, that, something like half-hearted negotiation. In a negotiation, very difficult to thrash out what for it was meant, the objectives for which the negotiation or agreement was made. So on those points, if time allows me, I will be making some comments. Before that, I would like to request the eminent scholar. We know him as an internationally reputed human rights expert, Dr. John Passe, University of North South Wales, on managing human rights, protection and institutions in transition in post-conflict constitution making. Dr. Passe.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Very much, Chairman. Dear colleagues, if I may congratulate also my dear friend Dr. Surya Dungal for his marvelous organization, particularly for leaving the best to the end. I mean, of course, the speech of the Prime Minister. Also, I'd like to beg for mercy from Professor Ghai a priori, because what I'm about to say, he will be not only free but entitled to tear to bits. My subject is the management of human rights protection and transition. And I have chosen to define, or to try to define, transition in as practical and therefore as generous a manner as possible, because in this way I'm hoping that any lessons that can be drawn from that might be useful to the current process in Nepal in regard to the finalization of its constitution. Interpreter, to whom I'm grateful a priori as well, I might be not following my text entirely, also because I do tend to talk too much. And out of respect to the chairman's statement, I will need to keep it a little shorter. You have to understand, out of the 40-odd years of my career, I spent a substantial period of time as a United Nations international civil servant with the task of sitting on a podium and listening to others making speeches. My only duty was to advise the chairperson on procedure and thrilling issues like that. And therefore, once I left the clutches of the bureaucracy, I was able to talk. The only problem is I forgot how to stop. And therefore, I rely on you and I rely on the chairman to call me to order as and when, but please be kind with that. So, transitions. Transitions can take various forms. Most transitions are characterized by conflict. And although one must presume that transitions follow upon conflict, they may also well be the cause for ensuing confrontation and conflict. This is often the case when transitions are not properly managed. There is no such thing as an instant transition, and some transitions take longer than others. One may describe some transitions as a form of accelerated evolution, whereas others may be described as a change of cataclysmic proportions. In any event, most transitions are usually in the making over extended periods and only become manifest as and when they surface, usually as a result of a combination of circumstances that trigger them. Each transition has its own particularities. Compare, for instance, the transitions that have taken place in the recent past, in Southeast Asia, for instance, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Cambodia. Look at the wealth of experiences that these cases present. In Eastern Europe, with the end of the Soviet Union and the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and the effect that has had and continues to have. There was a time in the 60s and early 70s when Latin America was wall-to-wall military dictatorships. Look at the transition of the entire continent or subcontinent over the years, still having its effects. In Europe, with the emergence of the European Union, starting already in the 50s, and look at Europe now in the century, and of course in Africa, where the historic transition in South Africa is perhaps among the most significant of all. By the same token, transitions are in the making around us. Some are easier to detect than others, particularly when conflict is involved, since conflict is symptomatic of failure to change through transition. Transitions may be said to reflect a revolution of one sort or another. They may present different characteristics, but they do have one clear and unquestionable common denominator, and that is the quest for the recognition and realization of human rights as a common denominator of the system by which society chooses to govern itself. This reflection is based on the experience and involvement that I have been privileged to make over the years. Over the last 40 years or so, I have been involved directly or indirectly in the human rights aspects of several transitions, including the countries I have mentioned. That is when I was not listening to speeches, I must say. That is when I was talking to the victims of transition, of conflict, and to the parties involved as a result of these situations. So managing human rights in transition, for purposes of this afternoon, involves three major elements. In the first place, the agreement on the substantive norms that constitute human rights. I must congratulate Dr. Gomez for this morning's presentation in this regard, and excuse myself if I'm going to echo some of the thoughts that he so well formulated this morning. So in the first place, we need to agree on the substantive norms that constitute human rights. Secondly, we have to agree on the identification of the institutional mechanism by which these norms are to be realized. Please note, I use the word realized. And perhaps most important in this case, the political will to ensure that the first two are effectively carried out, notably through respecting their freedom to act and the outcome of their actions, and guaranteeing the requisite resources to enable them to carry out their mandate, that is, the institutions. As for the first point, laudable as it may seem, this common denominator, that is the search for recognition and realization of human rights standards, has also provided further cause for conflict, as governments and other parties responsible for effecting transition choose to interpret clear and universally recognized norms in so-called relative terms when it comes to their application. Differences in appreciation in regard to implementation processes are not uncommon in human rights work, and therefore one should not be surprised to have such differences emerge from time to time. They have existed at the national level, as we have been hearing at this conference, as they have done at the international level. There has never been any doubt as to the content, but there are often differences when it comes to the modalities of their realization. The so-called movement for cultural relativism, for example, in the application of human rights, which emerged in the early 90s as the World Conference on Human Rights was in preparation, is a manifestation of this phenomenon. A common feature of this confusion is rooted in the refusal to accept the priority to be given to the treatment of human rights in their totality. Some countries hold that civil and political rights take priority over economic, social, and cultural rights, whereas others hold the opposite view. Both are wrong. International standards have long established and reiterated the interdependence and indivisibility of these sets of rights. Certainly, ensuring this interdependence is extremely complex and should not be underestimated, and imposes a challenge, even a burden, on governments that not many are prepared to face. Transitions, to be effective, need to ensure not only the recognition, but also the realization of human rights, whether in the civil political sector or the economic, social, and cultural sector. In societies that are made up of diverse groups, ethnic, religious, etc., this is particularly important. And let's face it, I have difficulty in finding any particular society these days that is not the product of such combinations of religion, ethnic, and other groups. This debate is not new. It marked the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration itself is perhaps the only international document where human rights are embodied in their totality. Regrettably, when it came to the realization, the Common Standard of Achievement, as it was called, adopted in 1948, was soon separated into two standards by 1952, when the General Assembly reluctantly agreed to the drafting of what has become the two international covenants. This absence of recognition of the need for a holistic and integrated approach to the realization of human rights proved to be a major obstacle in the fulfillment of one of the fundamental principles of the United Nations itself. All this to say that managing transition has to take into consideration and give priority to the integral realization of human rights norms. There should be no doubt as to the dimensions of the challenge. Recognition and even realization of civil and political rights is but a step in a process, at best a platform for the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. Although the two sets of rights are different, they are necessarily complementary and simply cannot be treated separately or independently. The institutional aspect. The institutional human rights focus will need to involve the widest spectrum of public participation process. Thus, a process of education is an essential element of transition. In this context, civil society, and in particular human rights non-governmental organizations, have a vital role to play, and they must be enabled to do it whilst respecting their independence. Civil society can consist of a very wide range of institutions. The wider the spectrum, the more likely it is to have a better prepared public participation. Often, politicians consider civil society a nuisance at best and hostile at worst. In Chile, they used to call them subversivos, subversive element of society, during Pinochet, mind you. Whereas this may be understandable, knowing politicians, it is, of course, unacceptable, since the contribution of civil society is an essential component of ensuring awareness and acceptance by the people. Somewhere between the political leadership and civil society are national human rights institutions, NHRIs, as they are known by the bureaucrats. Although recognized relatively recently at the international level, such institutions can and should play an important role in the management of transition. Indeed, very often, the establishment and/or strengthening of such institutions is itself the product of transition. Examples may be cited in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and indeed in Nepal, among other countries. Other institutions that facilitate transition are the so-called transitional justice institutions, including Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, commissions to investigate disappearances, and so on. They have worked well in many countries, although this does not necessarily mean that they should work well, equally well in all cases. Although these are mostly focused on addressing the past, they are really about ensuring a better future. They may be intended to forgive, but certainly not to forget, since it is in facing the past that one is best prepared for the future. Neither are they invoked instead of to replace judicial proceedings when the violations in question constitute serious crimes punishable by law. My third element, which is the need for the political will to ensure that the first two elements are effectively carried out, is a key to a successful transition. As is well known, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It is counterproductive to first define the norms, then to set up the institutions, and after all that, to watch these institutions not work. Politicians, I have nothing against politicians, but they do have a responsibility for constitution making, particularly once they are in government, need to try to exercise control over the efficiency of national institutions, inter alia, by limiting their resources. They tend to try to exercise control over them, inter alia, by limiting their resources. The National Commission of Australia, for instance, was severely circumscribed in its work by draconian cuts to its funding under the Liberal government between 1996 and 2007. The wider civil society is often controlled through limitation of their freedom of expression and/or freedom of movement, thus denying them the space that is vital for them to act. Transitional justice institutions are set up with the best of intentions, but they can also be subject to such pressures as civil society and national institutions, thus reducing, if not neutralizing, any positive influence that they might have on the process of transition. One should not be surprised at the cynical resort to the adoption of measures such as the setting up of national institutions by governments whose only objective is to stave off criticism of inaction in the face of serious allegations of human rights abuses. There are numerous national human rights institutions existing today that are purely cosmetic. In this context, an interesting situation arose when Indonesia established its National Human Rights Commission in 1993. At the time, the move was widely viewed with much cynicism. It was said that President Suharto had agreed to its establishment as window dressing to anticipate criticism at the World Human Rights Conference, which was a few weeks away from his decree. Ironically, experience shows that Komnas HaM played indeed a critical role in the transition from his dictatorship. So as they say in Italian, every evil has its own good. Concluding remarks. These three elements are also relevant to the current constitution-making process in Nepal. The constitution is the benchmark that will determine the next step in the transition of the country from internal armed conflict and instability to peace and stability. In regard to the first element, judging by the information available and by the existing interim constitution, it would seem that the substantive human rights provisions are consistent with Nepal's international human rights treaty obligations. Whether they reflect the concerns of the people will only be determined once the public consultation process is completed prior to its final adoption. One should ask oneself whether the involvement of the people has been accomplished or will be accomplished fully and fairly. In this context, one may mention that experience in Iraq, for instance, after the invasion and in the initial process of drafting the Constitution, an interim document drafted without any meaningful consultation of the people, the Transition Administrative Law, or TAL, although technically an excellent document, was largely ignored by the Constituent Assembly elected in 2005. The current proposal coming out of the Constituent Assembly in Nepal, for instance, would see not one national human rights institution as a constitutional body, but 7. No doubt this reflects a political consensus, but unless arrangements are made to ensure streamlining and coordination, not always easy, the work of all 7 human rights constitutional bodies is bound to be drastically and negatively affected. The question needs to be asked whether this is the best way to institutionalize the protection of human rights in the country as a whole and of the particular groups on the other. Some other national institutions have addressed the dilemma by enabling a national commission which incorporated the various sectoral bodies. The Indian Commission is one of them, for instance. Related to our third element, in addition to eroding the substantive effort at ensuring a successful human rights transition, the creation of multiple constitutional bodies dealing with various aspects of the same subject matter, that is the protection of human rights, is bound to have considerable negative effect on the provision of resources. Furthermore, the existing commissions, not yet constitutional bodies, are already seriously under-resourced in spite of their vital areas of concern. I refer to the National Women's Commission, to the Dalit Commission, and to the National Foundation for Indigenous Peoples in this country, and therefore of dubious value in ensuring the successful implementation of their mandates. A general consideration that needs to be kept in mind in this context is the proportion between what national institutions are asked to do and the means and recognition that the government and its agencies dedicate to them. Therefore, management of transition should be seen as a long-term process that needs focused policies harmonized around the essential values underlying international human rights standards, namely the dignity of the individual as an element of society. This in turn implies a political will shared among the parties in the transition so that the realization of human rights standards as defined, that is across the board, is a commonly shared priority and not an element on the bargaining table. This is no mean feat, but I ask those concerned to take heart. They can derive much inspiration from the fact that human rights has always intimidated some governments. I might recall that the articles of the United Nations Charter, which refer to human rights and include the fundamental principles of the organization among them, were not in the original draft of the Charter and were only included as a result of an amendment proposed unanimously by the 4 great powers of the time. The Charter of the UN is not only a historic document, but it should also be seen as the embodiment of the transition document par excellence, a transition at which the international community continues to chip away in the quest of fulfilling the objectives of the organization. Thank you.
Person is Dr. Larry Taman, International Project Manager, UNDP. He will be speaking on implementation of Constitution in post-conflict scenario. Dr. Tamang.
Dunganaji, thank you very much. Friends and colleagues, as many of you know, I've been in Nepal for nearly a year and a half as the head of the UN's Constitution Support Team. This does not make me an expert in Nepal, but I can tell you some of what I think I've learned in the following 4 propositions. Proposition 1, federalism is about power sharing, and power sharing through federalism is now the key to unlocking the potential of the new Constitution of Nepal. Proposition 2, the success or failure of the new Constitution will depend heavily on the people's perception of whether the transition to federalism is a success or a failure. Proposition number 3, to be a success, the transition to federalism must address some basic principles, which I will enumerate in a moment. And proposition number 4, the guiding framework for transition to federalism must be provided for in the Constitution itself and nowhere else. Let me look at each of these in a little more detail. Number 1, federalism is about power sharing, and power sharing through federalism is now the key to unlocking the vision of the new Nepal. I think it is vital for the people in this room, for Nepalis and for their international friends, to accept one political reality which to me seems beyond serious controversy. And it is this, that a root cause of the long and painful conflict here was the conviction of many that the previous regimes, their ideas and their governance systems had deprived most Nepalis of the most basic opportunities of life, and that they had made Nepal the poorest country in South Asia. Secondly, that until power is taken from elites and from the center and transferred to ordinary people and transferred outside the valley, the situation will not improve. And it is also believed that previous efforts to decentralize have been an effort of elites to maintain power rather than to share it. The people who believe this say that decentralization is at best a failure, and at worst, as Purnaman Shakya said yesterday, a gimmick that was never intended to share power. Now, those who hold this conviction represent a substantial part of the population, and they believe that federalism is a vital ingredient of social justice and democratization for Nepal. For those of you who disagree and who suspect that federalism is not the answer, I acknowledge at once that it is not the only answer. And for those of you who are seeking to negotiate another course, of course, this is an issue for the Nepali people to continue to debate. But let me remind you that Nepal is already a federal republic under the terms of its interim constitution, that federalism is the fundamental operating principle that underpins all the work of the Constituent Assembly, and that in one form or another, it is clearly the way forward that the people, through their elected and proportionate representatives, are now working on. So, the perception is that if the new Constitution provides for meaningful power sharing through federalism, and if it is successfully implemented, then there will be a new beginning for inclusion and for social justice. And if this does not happen, there is a real chance of return to conflictual politics. Proposition number 2, the success or failure of the new Constitution will depend heavily on the people's perception of whether the transition to federalism is a success or failure. By transition, I am thinking about the path to power sharing through federalism. I am thinking particularly about the early steps, about making a good start, and then making steady progress to building the newly structured state. Let's think together about May 29th, 2010, the day after the Constitution is proclaimed. On that day, there will be happy people and there will be unhappy people. The unhappy people who did not get a province that they were promised, or a right they say is guaranteed, or a social and political right that is justiciable, they will not quickly become happy people. For some of them, bringing them into the new nation will take a great deal of time. But there will be happy people, those who see in the Constitution a vision of a new future, and those who are just glad that the debating is over and the nation building has begun. They have been told that federalism is the key. It will, they have been told, increase their influence in the local matters that concern them the most. It will, they have been told, create state and local institutions that are closer to them and more subject to their control. And it will, they have been told, open the door to new political leadership and new public servants who will break with the old ways. So these happy people, and maybe some of the unhappy ones, will wait to see whether their lives do indeed improve under federalism. And here I speak of all lives, not just some lives. Will their security improve, or will impunity survive? Will health and education and job training and other social services improve? For those with property, will their property be fairly dealt with? Will their business be allowed to prosper? For civil servants who do not wish to move from Kathmandu to Karnali, will they be fairly dealt with and treated with dignity? I have said they will wait to see the answers to these questions, but how long will they wait? In our work at the Center for Constitutional Dialogue and in our Loktantric Sambads, or democracy dialogues all over Nepal, we have talked to nearly 200,000 people from all parts of Nepali society, in addition to independent research we have done. Anyone can see